So this is our third webinar for the Ponderful project. Today we have Dr. Meredith Holgerson. Thank you so much, Meredith, for accepting this invitation. I think it will be a very, very nice talk today. Meredith is an assistant professor of ecology and evolutionary biologist. She's a freshwater ecologist who is working at the intersection of ecosystem and community ecology and conservation. She receives her bachelor degree from Denison University, her master's from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and her Ph.D. from Yale University. For her postdoctoral research, she held a Smith Conservation Research Fellowship, and her current research focuses on ponds and wetland greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration, ecosystem productivity, and how community dynamics influence ecosystem processes. So this is a subject that we are studying also in Ponderful, and it will be really nice to hear what Dr. Meredith has to say today. So thank you. I will give my words to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and try to not mess up the screen share. All right. How does that look?
It's look good. It's perfect.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you again for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak. I have been eagerly following along with the Ponderful project on social media, and it's just incredible that you've secured all this funding, created an incredible network across Europe, and are doing really exciting research on ponds. So I'm excited to chat with you today, and for hopefully some discussion that will follow at the end. So I guess in terms of what I'll be talking about, right? The local and global importance of pond ecosystems. I don't have to sell this to you. You all know that ponds are really important ecosystems. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is from an ecosystem perspective, mostly thinking about carbon cycling in ponds. And I like to start off with this figure that shows that ponds are understudied relative to lakes. So what you can see here is the number of published studies on the y-axis over time. On the x-axis, this was originally in one of John Downing's papers. And I updated it looking at the number of studies that have lake in the title in red versus pond in the title in blue. So you can see that while the literature has been growing for both lakes and ponds, lakes has been growing faster, and there's far more studies on lakes than ponds. I think that this is in stark contrast to the distribution of water bodies worldwide. So now what we're looking at is the number of water bodies on the y-axis in a logarithmic scale, and logarithmic size classes of water bodies. And 3 different studies that have tried to estimate the size class distribution of water bodies worldwide. And what you can see from all of these studies is that over 75% of the water bodies that are mapped are less than a hectare in size. And if we try to estimate those smaller systems, it's estimated that there's somewhere between 500 million to 3 billion of these smallest water bodies that we don't do a great job of mapping. It's really tricky with satellites. And then if we remove the log scale on the y-axis, you can see this exponential relationship, right? So the vast majority of our water bodies are small enough to be considered ponds, yet they're not studied at the same rate that lakes are. And maybe that's okay. I think we all are going to argue that it's not, right? But you could argue that maybe that's okay if ponds are just little lakes. If we can take what we know from lakes and scale down to what the size of a pond would be. And for a while, we thought pond ecosystems were just smaller versions of lakes. But we have growing evidence that that may not be accurate. One reason for that is that ponds are more biodiverse on an aerial basis than lakes. And this is work that has come out of Europe, right? Thinking about pondscapes, how if we want to protect amphibians and macroinvertebrates that are using these smaller water bodies, we need to protect ponds on the landscape. And we also need to protect multiple different types of ponds on the landscape that are stepping stones for these creatures. I'm going to focus a bit more on the biogeochemistry of these systems today, but we know that ponds intercept and retain nutrients and sediments, thereby improving downstream water quality. But we also know that in doing so, they're emitting high amounts of methane. And they can also store high quantities of carbon in the sediments. And this was a study that also came out of Europe looking at these, they called them ponds. They're 1 by 1 meter kind of puddle ponds, right? But they were storing a lot of carbon and suggesting that not only are these systems emitting a lot of methane, they're storing carbon. And so we've got ecosystem services and disservices happening in the same system. But greenhouse gas emissions are extremely variable in small systems, and carbon burial rates are understudied. But all of this is suggesting that pond ecosystems may function differently than lakes, and it may be important to study them in their own right. So while we can start to see that ponds may function differently than lakes, I co-led a team through GLEON, the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network, to investigate these differences a little more quantitatively. And part of the reason for doing so is that I often get the question, what is a pond? And how do you separate a pond versus a lake? How are they different? And I'm not sure if you get the same questions, but I wanted to try to answer this question in a quantitative way. So I'm going to just summarize briefly what we did and what we found to lay the foundation for the rest of the talk. So what we did was we examined a set of ecosystem functions, and we examined their relationship with both surface area and depth. So what I'm showing you here is surface area on the x-axis in hectares, and then a variety of these ecosystem functions. So things like gross primary productivity, methane flux, nitrogen, diel temperature range, chlorophyll, right? So the set of 9 variables that we looked at. And if there's really no relationship with size, or if it's a linear relationship with size, then distinguishing between a pond and a lake might not make much sense, or maybe we can just scale down what we know about lakes to ponds. But if these relationships aren't linear, then that's going to suggest that ponds may function pretty differently than lakes. So what we found was that for surface area, 8 of these relationships were not linear. Gross primary productivity was the only one that didn't have a significant relationship. You can see that it's a wedge shape. So this would suggest that these smaller systems that aren't as well represented are more variable than the large ones. And then all the others, you can see this threshold change, where as the systems get bigger, they're functioning differently than when they're small. And the average threshold changes that we found was 3.7 hectares in terms of size and 5.8 meters deep for depth. And so this is how we decided to come up with a semi-quantitative definition that I would love, feedback on. And also, this is an area where we need to build from, but that ponds are less than 5 hectares in size, shallow, less than 5 meters deep. The permanent or temporary, natural, or human-made comes from the literature. We did a literature review in this paper. And then with less than 30% emergent vegetation to separate out wetlands from ponds and shallow lakes. And this definition with depth also works pretty nicely with the shallow lake literature, where lakes and shallow lakes are separated around 5 meters in depth. So I think there's some really interesting questions that we can start to ask now, like, okay, size versus depth, where we have some small lakes that are really small but pretty deep, versus ponds versus shallow lakes, right? And then I still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to better figure out what that axis is for separating wetlands from shallow lakes and ponds. But some of these interesting questions that I'm now interested in asking are, why are ponds biogeochemical hotspots? Can we predict biogeochemical activity at local and global scales? What causes ponds to be more variable than lakes? How are humans influencing these biogeochemical rates? And can we manage human impacted systems or artificial water bodies to be more carbon friendly? Can we get systems that are already in a human dominated landscape or are built by humans, managed by humans? Can we reduce their methane emissions, right? So these are all questions that I'm really interested in thinking about. So for today's talk, it's going to be mostly about carbon. The first part of the talk is going to be about greenhouse gases, and the second part of the talk will be about carbon sequestration. So to start with a little bit of a basic background on carbon cycling in lakes and ponds. For some of you, you study this, you know this, and for some of you, you may not. So I just want to briefly go over some of these dynamics. So at the bottom of ponds, we have a lot of decomposition. That could be from tree leaf litter that's falling into the ponds. It could be, these emergent macrophytes or submerged macrophytes that are dying and decomposing. All of that decomposition creates our nice sediment muck layers on the bottom of lakes and ponds, and it can create an oxygen gradient where the sediments and even the bottom of these water columns can be anoxic, and then there can be oxygenated surface waters. That decomposition process is producing carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide can be taken up by our primary producers in the water column, and it can also diffuse out of the water column, moving from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So if there's a lot of CO2 in the water, these systems can release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Or if there's a lot of productivity, then these systems may be taking up CO2 from the atmosphere. There's also the production of methane that takes place usually under anoxic conditions. And that methane can be oxidized into carbon dioxide. And it can also diffuse out into the water column, again, moving from areas of high concentration to low concentration. Methane also bubbles. We'll call this ebullition. I might say bubbles or ebullition or ebullitive fluxes. These bubbles form because methane's not as water soluble as CO2. And so methane will form bubbles in the sediments, and then it will bubble out of the water column. There's also plant-mediated fluxes, plant-mediated emissions. These plants can act like straws, siphoning gases out into the atmosphere, oxygenating sediments. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it is an area of research in my lab that's just getting going. So based off of this kind of basic schematic, we are going to predict that ponds will have high emissions of methane due to having a high edge effect, right? There's a lot of terrestrial influence on these ponds relative to a lake. A low water volume means that more of this decomposition at the bottom can influence the water column. And these systems are shallow, meaning that they're often polymictic, mixing multiple times a year, which allows for the gases that are building up at the bottom of the water column to come up to the top and be exchanged with the atmosphere. So to answer some of these questions, I'm just going to highlight some of the more recent work that I've been doing. This is work that I did with Dr. Bridget Deemer, who works for the United States Geological Survey, and it was part of Judith Rosentretter's big analysis of methane fluxes from water bodies around the world, which I will mention in a few slides. And so we looked at methane fluxes that were diffusive and ebullitive, not plant-mediated. And we evaluated the role that small water bodies have, and also looked at the drivers of flux. And one of the first findings that we had, which confirmed some work I had done previously, is that methane flux is inversely related to water body size. So our smaller water bodies have greater total methane fluxes than our big water bodies. And we can see that 37% of the flux is captured in this first logarithmic size class. 60% of the flux are from water bodies that are less than a hectare in size. So ponds are the ones that are producing the most amount of methane that's coming out of global water bodies. And then we can also look at dissolved organic carbon. That relationship was the other big significant one with methane. Lakes that have more DOC have greater methane fluxes. Although we can see a lot less dots and a lot more scatter on this plot, a lot of the papers that we looked at did not report dissolved organic carbon concentrations. So as a field, I think we should look potentially into this mechanism more and also be measuring DOC with these measurements. And then if we look at the bubbles, right, ebullitive fluxes, we can see that the best predictor of ebullitive fluxes comes from chlorophyll. How productive is this system? More productive systems had more bubbles coming out, more methane bubbles. And as I mentioned, this was part of a bigger synthesis, looking at global aquatic methane emissions from streams and rivers to reservoirs behind dams to coastal systems and even the open ocean, and ponds were just, and lakes were just part of that. But what we found was that half of global methane emissions are from aquatic sources, and that includes wetlands, lakes, right? All of these different aquatic systems on Earth make up about half of the methane emissions. That includes, fossil fuels and biomass burning and agriculture, all of it. And it doesn't matter whether we use our mean or our median numbers, that's what we're finding. And lakes comprise somewhere between 10 to 20% of those total estimates. And you could, if we go down to, what we consider a pond, it could be 6 to 10% of these numbers at a global scale. So it's pretty significant and important to figure out the uncertainty around. And to highlight that uncertainty, here is the most recent methane budget from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And you can see the variation in like these lighter shades versus the darker shades. And you can also see the range of our estimates. And you can see that our freshwaters are the most uncertain of all of these numbers. Now, I think this might be because we're really honest about how we do our research and we provide uncertainty estimates. You look at the fossil fuel number and there's only a 2 teragram of methane per year error. And I don't believe that for a second. Some of that is because fossil fuel companies are in charge of reporting their own emissions. So there's definitely some challenges with compiling these numbers, but regardless, freshwaters are extremely uncertain and we have work to do to figure these numbers out. So some of my key recommendations, one is that we need to measure those bubbles. We found that the ebullitive fluxes can account for basically none of a pond or lake's emissions up to nearly all of their emissions. And it can be hard to predict that. We need more sampling in our smallest water bodies, so our ponds, and also our largest water bodies. We also need better temporal coverage. We do a pretty good job of sampling water bodies in the summer and not a great job of sampling water bodies in shoulder seasons or the rest of the year. And we also need to move towards more mechanistic models. I think we're getting close to the point where we can put these together to think about models of production, oxidation rates, and fluxes. But we definitely aren't there yet. So when I came to Cornell, one of the reasons I wanted to come here was for these experimental ponds. So this is an aerial image of a facility that I'm now the co-director of. We have 50 experimental ponds at this unit. We have some more down the road too. They're 30 by 30 meters in size. They're about 2.1, 2.2 meters deep. And they're really good replicates of each other. And so when I got here, I said, let's find some ponds that are like really similar to each other here, and let's study them for an entire season, from when the ice melts in the spring to when the ice forms in the fall. Let's look, every 2 weeks, sometimes it was every week, we would go out and measure greenhouse gas concentrations and fluxes. And this is what we found. And this was led by a postdoc in my lab, Dr. Nicholas Ray. And right here, we're looking at diffusive carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see the ice covered period. And then when the ice melts, we don't have much happening in terms of carbon dioxide fluxes. But then the ponds become a carbon dioxide sink for most of the summer. They're macrophyte dominated, and the macrophytes are pretty productive, and I think leading to a lot of carbon dioxide being taken up out of the atmosphere. And then when the macrophytes start dying back in August and September, we sort of, again, become neutral with the atmosphere. This is also when the ponds are pretty well mixed at this point in the year. And then by later in the fall, they become a source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, likely due to the breakdown of some of that organic matter from the macrophytes. Here we can see what's happening with diffusive methane fluxes. The ponds are always a source of methane to the atmosphere, but it can be a very small source in April and early May, and again in October, November. And in the summer, they can be a pretty big source of methane to the atmosphere, but it's variable across the summer. It's not a perfect bell-shaped curve. And I should mention what you're seeing here. Those thinner black lines are 4 replicate ponds, and then the thick colored line, that is the average of those 4 ponds. But you see these kind of ups and downs, and I think that's a really fascinating question. What's causing these ups and down fluxes? We think it could be explained by pond mixing dynamics, because we know that ponds can mix more frequently than lakes, right? Stratification isn't as stable as it is in deeper lakes. And so we're currently testing this hypothesis using these same whole pond replicates by mixing up some of the ponds and stratifying some of the ponds, and we're seeing how that relates to fluxes. Unfortunately, I don't have any preliminary data to share on that project, but it is in like month 6. I think Kathy, my PhD student, is really ready to be done with that field work. And then if we're looking at our bubbles, ablative methane peaks in late June and then sort of declines for the rest of the season. And there's not much bubbles that take place when the pond is cold in the spring or in the late fall. And so to summarize what I've been learning about pond greenhouse gas emissions and what our team has been studying, we know that diffusive greenhouse gas emissions relate inversely to water body size. We've been finding that the bubble fluxes relate to how productive the system is, and that water bodies that are less than a hectare in size, so ponds, account for 60% of methane emissions from lentic water bodies. But there's still a lot of uncertainty, and so we have more work to be done in terms of reducing this uncertainty and making more broad generalized patterns. And I think there's some things in the chat. This is like maybe a great time to take a question or two because we're about to switch to carbon sequestration. I don't know if there are questions in the chat or just, no, there aren't. Okay, if anybody wants to pause and ask a question, I'd be happy to take a question. Otherwise, there'll be time at the end too.
There are any questions now? Maybe we leave the discussion to the end. Oh, there is a hand. Mariana, you can ask the question.
Yes, thanks, Meredith, for a great talk so far. Yeah, now that you give the opportunity, then when you say that the ponds represent 60% of lentic methane emissions, this still by unit of surface, right? So that's per square meter of water. Ponds emits much more, or they represent this 60%. But when you make the estimations back to the surface area, total area represented by ponds, how much would that percentage become?
Yeah, so those numbers, it's sort of misleading because, can I make this go back?
I'm asking this concrete because that's the question that many practitioners make us. They said, okay, that's fine, but still ponds are so little. So
right.
when you put all of them together, still not that much surface. So and that also could imply, like, let's just bury all the ponds and then we get out of those emissions.
Yeah, great question. I should have clarified this. So what you're looking at is on an aerial basis, right? It's milligrams per square meter per day. But these numbers are after we account for how many there are and how much land area we think they make up. So we still need to do a better job at mapping ponds and figuring out exactly how many there are in the landscape. But we basically modeled what we think there are. We used some kind of middle of the road numbers for how many there likely are and how much surface area they make up. And that's where this 60% comes from.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, let's hop back over here. Okay, there'll be more time for questions at the end. I'm glad for that question to clarify. I should have been more clear about that. So we now know that ponds are these major greenhouse gas emitters, but they also store carbon. And I really wanted to find out, how much carbon are they storing? Are they storing enough carbon that's offsetting methane emissions? So, sorry, there is some construction happening in my building. I hope you can't hear the drill behind me. So we started taking sediment cores from both artificial human-made ponds as well as natural ponds and looking at carbon burial rates. And I want to share some data first from these ponds, Cornell's experimental ponds, where in 22 of these 50 ponds, we took 2 sediment cores from each pond. And we also mapped the sediment thickness. And I want to give credit to an undergraduate in my lab who led the sediment coring from these ponds, Chelsea. And we also mapped sediment thickness in the pond. So we went around with this John boat and we stuck a metal rod into the sediments and we mapped out the thickness of the sediments. And then we took 2 of these cores. And this is what the sediment thickness data look like. You can see that the shape of these ponds are inverted truncated pyramids. So it's like there's a littoral shelf and then a flat bottom. And you can see that where the littoral shelf meets the flat bottom, that tends to be a spot where sediment is accumulating. Because it's not a complete, upside down triangle or something, not all of the sediment gets focused to the middle. And so we mapped out the sediment thickness. We took some of these cores and we analyzed sections of the sediment cores for sediment characteristics and percent carbon. And we ran loss on ignition and also looked at percent carbon for some subset. And the lab work was led by another undergraduate in my lab, Perry. And we found that carbon burial rates in these experimental ponds average 67 grams of carbon per square meter per year and range between 38 to 114. So we have a pretty big range. And you can see here, I just compared to some global averages and ranges for wetlands and different types of freshwater wetlands around the globe, as well as North Temperate Lakes by Adam Heathcote and others. And so we're at numbers that are double that of North Temperate Lakes and similar to temperate wetlands. And in this paper that was just published, we also look back at the experimental pond management history, because all of the experiments that have been done in these ponds have been recorded through time. And so we were able to link up burial rates with things like nitrogen and phosphorus additions in the ponds, or macrophyte plantings or removals. And now that we've done a study on both the seasonal greenhouse gas fluxes from these ponds, as well as carbon burial rates, we can put all of these numbers together, right? We can put the greenhouse gas numbers together and the carbon sequestration numbers together to look at carbon dioxide equivalents, emissions, and we can see that it's dominated by methane. The diffusive methane is this dark orange, the ebullitive methane is the lighter orange, carbon dioxide is in green. We also looked at nitrous oxide. I haven't shown you any of that data because it ends up not being very important. They sort of bounce around between source sink dynamics. And we can see total emissions, and we can see that carbon dioxide is actually a net sink. The ponds are a net sink of CO2 with the atmosphere, but all of this methane leads to a big source. And we have an offset of about 37% of emission, or 39% of emissions. So we still are a net source to the atmosphere on a CO2e basis. But it's highlighting that if we could get a handle on that methane somehow, we might be able to flip these systems from being sources to sinks. And we can also compare these carbon burial rates to other aquatic systems. And we looked at mangroves and seagrasses. These are global numbers in panels A, B, and C, some global averages for different freshwater wetlands, for lakes and reservoirs, and then for 4 studies now that have been reporting this for ponds. And they're all human-made ponds. This was not looking at natural ponds, which there has not been a lot of data on. So you can see this, that there's a range. Ours was on the low side because our experimental ponds don't have any watersheds. So we're basically able to take that part of it away. So we knew that our numbers would be lower and look at some of these drivers. We also have been really interested in getting numbers for natural ponds because there's not very many numbers for natural ponds globally. And we think that burial rates might be really high. So we looked at 2 different ponds, and they're both pretty similar in size, but they're different depths. So Texas Hollow Pond is a little over a meter deeper than Mud Pond. And as a result, Texas Hollow Pond is permanently stratified during the summer, and Mud Pond is intermittently mixing. So every couple of weeks, days to weeks, Mud Pond will mix and Texas will be stratified in the summer. And I think those mixing regimes influence organic matter composition in the sediments. In Texas Hollow, we have on average 71% organic matter content through time, through this 1.2 meter profile. And Mud Pond, the average organic matter content was 26%. It's likely because Texas Hollow has anoxic bottom waters for the whole summer. So organic matter breakdown is going to be much slower and not as efficient as in Mud Pond, where we have oxygen throughout the water column. Despite differences in organic matter content, we see pretty similar organic carbon burial rates through time from the early 1900s to the early 2000s. This was sediment that went away for dating, and then we were able to look at burial rates. And the reason for that, these numbers being somewhat similar, despite the fact that Texas Hollow has so much greater organic matter content, is sediment deposition rates. Mud Pond has much greater sediment deposition rates, but it breaks down that sediment better. And so we can put natural ponds down here, right? That natural ponds have burial rates somewhere in this range that is going to be much greater than lakes on the same scale as what we're seeing in reservoirs, and greater than most of our freshwater wetlands as well. So to summarize for our pond carbon burial, our ponds have much higher carbon burial rates than lakes in north temperate regions, especially our natural ponds. Ponds have the potential to be carbon sinks on a mass balance basis, but it's that methane that blows the budget. So in terms of greenhouse gas warming potential, methane is definitely our biggest challenge. And so there are questions like, how can we reduce our pond methane emissions? And I currently have some work. I was hoping to pull together some preliminary data for you, and I didn't have the time, but we have some state funding that's looking at pond greenhouse gas emissions and carbon burial in the same system. So we're studying a bunch of natural and artificial ponds, and we're studying the emissions and the burial rates. And one of the big things that I hope to take away from this project when it's done is to propose some management strategies for our state, because I'm not sure if this is happening in Europe, but it's happening here, where our state agencies are providing subsidies, providing funding to farmers to build more ponds on their farms as a climate resiliency strategy. As we experience more and more droughts, we need to have more water bodies on the landscape that people can use to water crops or to water animals. And they don't want to be creating more water bodies that are just pumping out methane to the atmosphere. So we're testing some possible strategies, and we're looking at characteristics of these ponds and trying to figure out, why do we have some ponds that emit very little and other ponds that emit so much? This summer, we tested what an aerator will do to methane emissions, for instance. So this is that current work that we have going on, looking at greenhouse gas emissions and carbon burial in natural wetlands, which I didn't have time to talk about today, as well as these are two of our human-made ponds. Here we are taking sediment cores in the winter, because it's way easier to do on ice than from a boat. And to conclude, we have ponds that are biogeochemical hotspots. They're understudied, globally abundant, big methane emitters, but potential for net carbon storage if we can get a handle on that methane. And I'd argue, that ponds are different than lakes, and they do broaden our limnological understanding. So I'm so excited for your projects and potentially ways that our projects intersect, and maybe there's room for some collaboration. And with that, this has really been a team effort, including, global collaborations with Leon and my team here at Cornell and a variety of funding agencies. And I think I talked pretty quickly, but I hope I now have some time for discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It was really, really interesting. And yes, we are working in similar topics, and the collaboration will be really nice. We have a question in the chat. Maybe I can start with that one. Ivan asks, did the experimental ponds differ in macrophyte cover? If yes, were any patterns of carbon burial in ponds with different dominant groups of plants?
Yeah. So this is something I'm really excited to explore further. The stuff that I showed you today, those ponds all had really similar macrophyte communities, which was intentional. We tried to pick the ponds that, they've diverged over their 60-year lifespan. So we picked ones that were more similar with a preliminary year of data. The dominant communities were Elodea, Myriophyllum, and what was the third one? Ceratophyllum demersum, coontail. So those three, and they were similar we did snorkel surveys and quadrats, and we have a lot of data on that now. We also have had a graduate student of mine did a limnocorral study in the pond. So she put these limnocorrals through the water column in the experimental ponds, and then she added herbicide to kill the macrophytes, and she left some macrophytes alone, and then she let some macrophytes alone and put duckweed, floating lemna, on top. And so she's looking to see how these different plant communities influence greenhouse gas emissions. And this past summer, we sampled 28 artificial ponds, and we found ponds that had no macrophytes, ponds that were chock full of macrophytes. And so we did do macrophyte surveys, and we have both biomass rake tosses and species identification. So that's something that I really want to dig into further. I would be happy to chat if that's something that is also being studied across the big pond.
Does anyone have questions? You can raise your hand or just simply ask. I think Mariana, no?
Yes. Thanks again for the fantastic talk. Yeah, you finished saying that now you want to have guidelines or recommendations how to build ponds to minimize emissions. And here in Uruguay, South America, we have the same process of an exponential creation of artificial ponds in the rural landscape, mostly to give water for cattle, also for small-scale irrigation. We also have large reservoirs for irrigation, but the small ponds are increasing by the thousands. And we also want to have some recommendations, and it seems that also based on our findings and also your findings, then reducing trophic state or reducing chlorophyll would be the way to go. And that in rural landscapes where the areas used for production, that would mean trying to have buffer zones or some sort of protection to the nutrients entering the ponds. And so are you going that way, analyzing effects of riparian zone, different buffer strips with species, or is there any consideration of that given by the authorities for the farmers?
Yes, such a good question. I have so many thoughts. We have been thinking a lot about this. Buffer strips, I don't know in your countries how farmers feel about buffer strips. It's been hard just to get riparian buffer strips.
They don't. They just dig a hole and let it get green.
Yes. So I lived in the middle of the country for a couple of years before coming here, which is where a lot of our big ag takes place. And the state of Minnesota had just created a law requiring buffer strips for streams. They didn't have one for their ponds, but a lot of farmers really didn't like these buffer strips on streams. But when I talked to landowners here in New York State, some have already put plants around their ponds because they like the way the natural plants look. And then we have farmers that we have a pond on a farm and there's no buffer at all. And so we are looking at that. We're also looking at the height of the trees or the plants around the pond in terms of sheltering from the wind, because we think that mixing and stratification are playing a role in these dynamics too. So that's, I mean, the field work is still ongoing, and so we're wrapping that up and we're going to be moving towards the analysis phase on that project. But I do think that like how far away the plants are, what types of plants we're seeing could have a big influence on the nutrients coming in. And then the other thing that you say is trophic state. And I'm struggling a little bit with ponds compared to lakes on like what trophic state and like what characteristics we should be using, because the macrophyte ponds, those macrophytes take up lots of nutrients and they store those nutrients all season long, and our chlorophyll values can be really low, but our macrophyte biomass number is extremely high. And so I've been thinking about like, is it the point where, and maybe this would be a really fun collaboration for lots of us on the call to think about, is it time to think about a different type of trophic state definition? And I know there was a paper that just came out recently on some of these topics, but I think we have to think about macrophytes. Maybe we need to think about gross primary production instead of chlorophyll. But if total phosphorus numbers are really low, chlorophyll numbers are really low, but macrophyte biomass is really high, that doesn't mean we have a low productivity pond. It just means that those macrophytes are sequestering those nutrients. So I think like two interesting questions there, right? Like, how are we categorizing trophic state for ponds? And then, yes, buffer strips are probably where we need to go.
If I may continue, then of course I fully agree that a trophic state classification or index should be different for ponds, also for those covered with free-floating plants, which are very common. And then there's absolutely no chlorophyll. There's also no oxygen, no life, right? And so, and huge amounts of methane.
Yeah.
So chlorophyll is definitely not the best predictor when you have the full spectra of ponds.
Yeah.
So I agree, and I'm happy to collaborate with that.
That'd be fun. Yeah, and floating is also so interesting, like floating plants like the duckweed, right? Nobody likes duckweed, and duckweed is really problematic. But then you have some floating plants that people really like, right? Like lily pads are a nice floating plant that people enjoy. Which is also, I think, like the perception of ponds is really interesting too. And we have some social science collaborators right now to think about like, how do people perceive ponds and use ponds, and how does that vary based off of pond type? And maybe we need to manage for different types of ponds on the landscape too, not just for biodiversity, but for people use.
I agree. Thanks.
Yeah.
Meredith, we have also another question here in the chat from Jose Teixeira. There has been a widely used the message that ponds can be important tools to mitigate climate change, namely by CO2 burial. Based on your data on methane emission, should we be much careful with this message?
I think so. I do. I also think there's hope, right? Like, I think there's hope that if we could reduce methane emissions, these ponds could be sinks for carbon dioxide. But right now, the systems that I've been studying are net sources. So even the natural ponds, it looks like our preliminary data is showing that because of methane, they're net sources. So yeah, there's lots of reasons to conserve ponds, right? Like biodiversity is a big one that comes to my mind, and that people like them and people use them, and utilitarian reasons. But right now, I don't see that. My work, at least, is not showing that they're a benefit to carbon, but maybe they could be, right? So I mentioned that we're piloting this solar aerator. So we have a solar aerator in one of our experimental ponds all summer, and we haven't looked at the data yet, but we know that the pond is much more oxygenated. It's much more mixed, and maybe we should see reductions in methane emissions. And that could be a simple thing that farmers could do. We're also looking at the plant community, both the macrophytes and chlorophyll. Maybe there's other benefits of aeration too, or maybe there's detriments. So we still need to figure that out.
Okay, thank you. Anyone has any more questions? No. Well, if we don't have any more questions. Wait, I think there is one in the chat from Tol. Which one is more effective to mitigate climate change, using artificial ponds or natural ones? Will the different ponds provide different results more specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I will have a better sense of it after we look at all of our data from this year, because we did sample 28 ponds for both greenhouse gas emissions and carbon burial rates. And we have them like across the landscape, from forested ponds to farm ponds. But the other thing to think about in terms of climate change and mitigating climate change is our natural ponds have, at least in this region, they've been around for 14,000 years since the last glaciation. And methane has a short half-life in the atmosphere. It's like 12 years. So assuming we aren't increasing methane production, which is an incorrect assumption based off of our data, right? Like if we increase productivity because of nutrient runoff, then we're going to increase methane emissions. But there has been some amount of methane emissions that has been occurring over the entire lifetime of these ponds. So there's interesting articles about accounting for greenhouse gases and accounting for natural systems that have been emitting for thousands of years. They're not actively contributing to new methane emissions and to climate change in the same way that building a farm pond or a residential pond might do, right? So we have to think about what's on the human side of the budget and what's on the natural side of the budget. So if we're adding all these ponds, like what Marianne said, right, like adding thousands of ponds to the landscape and they're all emitting methane, then we're not mitigating climate change. But if we could flip them from being sources to sinks, then we could actually be contributing to solutions rather than contributing to emissions. So I think the natural ones, you know, part of the natural budget, it might be important to try to figure out how much humans are influencing those emissions. Like we've increased them 30% or we've increased them 20%. What percent has increased due to human modification of the landscape? But they are accounted for differently in terms of global carbon budgets with the anthropogenic side of things versus the natural side of things.
Yeah. Thank you. More questions? No? Well, I would like to thank Meredith for coming and accepting this invitation, and thank you so much for this interesting talk.
Yeah, thank you for all being here. And I can put my email in the chat. It's also probably not hard to find online, but I'd be happy to chat more about any of these topics or think about collaborations. Yeah, I thank you for having me.
Yes, it's perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming and listening. We will going to add this webinar on our channel on YouTube, so you can always see it again if you are interested. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.